Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with something solid. Literally solid. We're talking about castles. Big, stony, chilly fortresses that medieval people decided were a great idea to live in. Even though, let's be honest, they were basically damp prisons with nicer curtains, so go ahead, dim the lights. Find a comfortable spot. Maybe pull up a blanket. Because tonight we're taking a slow walk through the defensive masterpieces of the Middle Ages. We'll drift through drawbridges, peek through arrow slits, and probably complain about the draftiness along the way. Now, if you've ever seen a castle, maybe in a fantasy show, or maybe you stumbled across one while pretending to be interested in your aunt's European vacation photos, you might think, wow, that's majestic. And it is. But medieval people didn't build them to look nice on postcards. They built them because, well, everyone was trying to kill everyone else. The Middle Ages were kind of like one long neighborhood feud that got way out of hand. Lords fought barons, barons fought kings, kings fought the Pope, and the peasants mostly just tried to not get trampled in the process. So when you're surrounded by enemies, what do? You build a giant stone box and hope it keeps everyone out. Let's start from the ground up, and literally, the earliest medieval. Castles weren't those elegant stone fortresses with towers and turrets. Nope, the first ones were basically dirt piles. They were called motte and bailey castles. Imagine a big mound of earth, the motte, with a wooden tower on top. Below it, a fenced courtyard called the bailey. It was the medieval version of a starter home. Affordable, quick to build, and prone to catching fire. But at least it was something. A wooden wall is better than no wall, especially when your neighbors occasionally show up with torches and pitchforks. These early castles were built mostly after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, when William the Conqueror and his friends showed up, said this is ours now, and started sprinkling motte and baileys all over the English countryside like particularly aggressive garden gnomes. Wood was easy. Stone was expensive, but stone also had the distinct advantage of not burning down when someone threw a flaming arrow at it. So over time people decided, yeah, maybe we should invest in something a little more permanent. The Stone Age of castles and the art of making walls thicker than your patience. By the 12th century, serious castle construction had gone full stone core aesthetic. Massive keeps, the big central towers, started popping up all over Europe. The keep was the heart of the castle and the last line of defense. Thick walls, tiny windows, and enough staircases to confuse anyone who dared to attack. These walls weren't just thick. They were absurdly thick. We're talking up to 12 feet of solid stone. You could host a small dinner party inside the wall if you wanted to, and sometimes they actually did. Hidden passageways, storage chambers, secret stairwells. Castles were like stone mazes designed by people who were both paranoid and incredibly creative. Of course, the main goal wasn't luxury. It was survival. The idea was simple. Make it so difficult to get in that most attackers would give up and go home, you know, kind of like medieval customer service. The moat, or as I like to call it, the medieval version of keep out. Everyone knows moats. That wide, dramatic stretch of water surrounding the castle, with maybe a drawbridge across it, and some swans pretending to be useful. Here's the thing, though. Not all moats were filled with water. Some were dry. Just giant ditches dug around the castle to slow down attackers. Because even if you're the most dedicated invader, there's something demoralizing about having to climb down into a hole, then up again, while people above you drop rocks on your head. Water moats were more common in lowland areas, and they weren't just decorative. A deep, muddy moat made it hard to roll siege towers up to the walls. And since sanitation wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit, moats often became, let's say, biologically rich. Yes. Sewage sometimes drained into them, which meant that even if an attacker did fall in, they'd come out with more than just a bruise. So in a twisted way, the moat was both a barrier and an early form of biological warfare. Drawbridges and gates, the anxiety doors of the Middle Ages. The drawbridge is iconic. It's the part of the castle you could pull up when you didn't want company. Kind of like slamming the front door, but louder and more satisfying. Drawbridges usually led to the main gatehouse, which was the single most dangerous place for an attacker to be. Because once you got through that first door, congratulations, you're in the murder corridor. The gatehouse had multiple layers of defense, heavy oak doors, metal portcullises, those big iron grates that drop down dramatically, and narrow slits above where defenders could pour boiling oil, drop rocks, or if resources were tight, just dump buckets of unpleasant substances. If you somehow survived all that, there was still the inner gate, and possibly another portcullis. Basically, getting through a castle gate was like playing a medieval version of American Ninja Warrior, except everyone's trying to kill you. Arrow slits, for when you want to shoot people politely from a distance. Arrow slits, or embrasures, are one of the easiest castle features to spot. They're those thin vertical openings that look like someone forgot how windows work. The idea was simple. Defenders could shoot arrows out, but attackers couldn't shoot back in, at least not effectively. It's like a tiny murder peephole. Over time, castle designers got clever. They widened the inside of the slit, so archers could angle their shots better, covering a wider area outside. Some were even shaped like crosses, allowing for both vertical and horizontal aiming. The medieval version of multitasking. Of course, being stationed at one wasn't glamorous. You'd stand there for hours shooting arrows through a hole, breathing in smoke and damp air while your feet slowly froze. Romantic, right? Walls that fight back, machicolations and battlements. If you've ever looked at a castle and noticed those square gaps along the top of the walls, that's not bad masonry. That's a battlement. The raised sections are merlons. The gaps are crenels. Together, they form crenellations, which allowed defenders to pop up, shoot, and duck back down. It's basically an ancient game of whack-a-mole, but with arrows, and then came machicolations. These were projecting stone ledges with openings in the floor, so defenders could drop things, rocks, boiling oil, or whatever was handy, directly onto attackers below. Imagine standing under one of those while trying to bash down a gate. You look up, and bad idea. Machicolations were both practical and psychological. Even if nobody dropped anything, just seeing them could make an attacker think twice. Because no one wants to be that guy who gets hit in the face by a medieval toilet bucket. Towers, because round things are harder to destroy. Early castles often had square towers. The problem? Corners. When someone hits a square tower with a catapult, the corners take the brunt of the impact and collapse faster. So by the 13th century, castle architects said, what if round towers were stronger? Projectiles deflected off more easily, and the defenders inside could move around with better visibility. Plus, round towers just looked cooler. They also gave defenders overlapping fields of fire, meaning archers in one tower could cover the space in front of another. If you tried to sneak up on one part of the wall, congratulations. You were now a target for 3 others. Siege engines, the original delivery systems. Of course, no castle defense story is complete without siege engines. Those terrifying wooden contraptions that looked like they were built out of IKEA parts and bad intentions. Attackers used battering rams, catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers, each designed to test just how much stone it took to ruin someone's day. Trebuchets, in particular, were both elegant and horrifying. They used a massive counterweight to fling heavy stones, or occasionally dead animals, over long distances. Nothing says we'd like to negotiate, quite like launching a diseased cow into someone's courtyard. But castles adapted. Walls became thicker, towers rounder, and defensive strategies smarter. It became a constant arms race, a slow, stony chess game that lasted centuries. Life inside during a siege, a medieval misery in real time. Now, let's imagine what it was like inside a castle under siege. You've pulled up the drawbridge, locked the gates, and everyone's huddled in the courtyard wondering how long the food will last. Spoiler, not long. A siege could last weeks, months, or, if you were really unlucky, years. Fresh food ran out first. Then came salted meat, stale bread, and eventually the kind of creative meals people prefer not to talk about in polite company. Water was another problem. If your castle didn't have its own well, you were basically done for once the moat water became undrinkable, which, given medieval hygiene, didn't take long. Disease often finished the job before the enemy did. It turns out that cramming hundreds of scared, hungry people inside a damp fortress isn't exactly a recipe for good health. But still, people endured. Because surrendering was worse. If the attackers finally broke through, things got unpleasant. So you stayed put, prayed, and hoped the walls held a little longer. The psychological game, castles as symbols. Eventually, castles weren't just military structures. They became statements. Big, cold, arrogant statements. A castle on the horizon said, "I'm in charge here. Don't even think about it." They projected power, control, and legitimacy. Building one was as much about politics as protection. If you were a medieval lord, a castle wasn't just your home. It was your brand. And the more impressive your defenses, the more your enemies would sigh and go, "Ugh, not again." And that's how the medieval world came to be dotted with these stony monuments to paranoia and pride. They weren't comfortable and they weren't romantic. Not really. But they were effective. When invaders came knocking, castles stood silent and stubborn, weathering storms, sieges, and centuries. And somehow even now they still stand. Long after the battles ended, the lords died and the moats dried up. All right. We've admired the big stone walls and pointy towers from the outside. Now let's gently creak open the door, step inside, and see what life was actually like behind all that masonry. Because, spoiler, castles weren't exactly cozy sanctuaries of medieval luxury. They were more like heavily armed mazes that occasionally doubled as drafty apartment buildings. When you picture a medieval castle interior, you might think of warm fireplaces, fur rugs, and giant tables covered in roasted meat. And sure, that happened, but only on good days. Most of the time it smelled like smoke, sweat, damp stone, and depending on the week, a touch of manure. The layout, built for confusion, on purpose. Medieval architects were not just builders. They were psychological warfare specialists. Every hallway, staircase, and doorway was designed with one goal in mind: make it impossible for an invader to know where the hell they are. Castles weren't laid out symmetrically. They zigged, they zagged, they twisted like a labyrinth built by someone who hated straight lines. Because if attackers ever made it inside, you didn't want them heading straight for your throne room like it was an open-concept Airbnb. Everything was about control. Defenders knew the shortcuts, the secret doors, the hidden spiral staircases. Invaders didn't, and that alone could turn a small garrison of defenders into a nightmare for anyone who tried to storm the Gu. Placed at the spiral staircase, the subtle murder design of architecture. Okay, let's talk about spiral staircases. They're everywhere in castles. They look elegant now, like something you'd find in a fancy boutique hotel. But back then they were tactical. Most spiral staircases in castles went clockwise upward. That's not random. That's genius-level passive aggression. Why? because an attacker coming up the stairs would have to swing their sword with their right hand, and the central pillar of the staircase would be right in the way. Meanwhile, the defender standing above had all the space in the world to swing down at you, gravity, angle, and architecture, all teaming up to ruin your day. And if the attackers somehow made it halfway up, there might be a narrow window or murder hole built into the wall, just in case defenders wanted to throw down rocks or, heart soup. Because who doesn't like soup with a little bit of tactical advantage? The Great Hall and the medieval living room, but colder. Every castle had a Great Hall. It was the social hub, the dining area, the court, and sometimes the bedroom. Basically, if you were important, this was your stage. Long wooden tables, banners fluttering, a few unlucky servants trying to keep the fires going while everyone complained about the smoke. The fire, by the way, was usually in the middle of the room, not in a fireplace. So you'd sit there, trying to eat your mutton while coughing through a fog of wood smoke and ambition. The lords and ladies would sit at the raised dais end, literally above everyone else, because even dinner had to be hierarchical. If you were a servant or a lower-ranked knight, you sat further down the table, closer to the door where the draught was strongest. And yes, they really did throw bones on the floor for dogs to eat, because apparently cleaning up was for peasants, and dogs were the medieval Roombas. The keep, basically a panic room with furniture. The keep, or donjon, was the heart of the castle, that tall, imposing central tower. It was both home and final stronghold. If everything went wrong, everyone retreated here, slammed the doors, and hoped for the best. Inside the keep, you'd find several floors, storage rooms, kitchens, chapels, and living quarters. Each level could be sealed off individually, so if invaders broke in, defenders could retreat upward like medieval squirrels climbing for safety. The stairs between levels were often hidden or could be blocked by heavy wooden doors. Some castles even had trap doors that could be dropped open to send attackers falling into dark basements. You could almost hear the faint medieval echo of surprise. But for all the strategic genius, daily life in the keep wasn't glamorous. Stone walls were cold, damp, and impossible to heat. Candles gave off more soot than light. And drafts. Oh, the drafts. People stuffed straw into cracks and hung heavy tapestries on the walls just to make rooms bearable. Even then, you'd probably sleep under about 7 layers of fur and still wake up cold. So yes, castles were defensible fortresses, but they were also early prototypes for seasonal depression. Windows, the medieval version of kind of see-through walls. You might have noticed castle windows are tiny. That wasn't for aesthetic minimalism. Big openings give us big targets. So most windows were little more than narrow slits, especially on the lower levels. The only big windows you'd find were in the upper floors, often in chapels or great halls, areas less likely to be attacked. Even then, they didn't have glass until later centuries. Instead, people used oiled parchment, thin horn, or just wooden shutters. So, depending on your social rank and the weather, you were either living in gloomy candlelight or icy cross breezes. The gatehouse interior, the real murder maze. Remember the gatehouse from part 1? Let's step inside one slowly. The gatehouse wasn't just a door. It was a defensive death trap. A multi-layered puzzle of gates, chambers, and ceilings full of holes. Attackers might break through the first set of doors and think, "We're in." Nope. They'd find themselves in a narrow stone corridor with heavy gates slamming down behind and ahead of them. Above, there'd be murder holes where defenders could rain down arrows, stones, or boiling liquids. And in case you're wondering, yes, boiling oil was a thing, but more often they used boiling water. Hot sand or even molten pitch. Oil was expensive. Hot sand was cheaper and honestly just as terrible. The entire gatehouse was like a medieval anxiety dream. Claustrophobic. noisy and full of ways to die before breakfast. Secret. Passages and hidden doors. The castle's quiet. Mysteries. You've probably seen those. Secret doors in old castles. The ones hidden behind tapestries or disguised as stone panels. They were real. Not as dramatic as in movies, but practical. Most secret passages led between important rooms, down to storage areas, or out to escape tunnels under the moat. The idea was to give the lord and his family a quick getaway route if things went very, very wrong. Some even led to nearby forests or riverbanks. Imagine crawling through a dark, damp tunnel for half an hour just to pop out in a bush. Congratulations. You're alive and covered in centuries of regret. Of course, over the years, many of these passages were forgotten, bricked up or lost to time. So yes, if you ever visit a real medieval castle and feel a weird draft in one wall, there's a tiny chance there's an escape tunnel behind it. Or it's just bad insulation, which statistically is more likely. Defensive architecture inside the castle. Passive-aggressive design choices. One of the smartest and funniest defensive features inside castles was something called a barbican. This was a fortified outpost or extension before the main gate, basically a "you thought you made it but you didn't" zone. But smaller features were hidden everywhere. Low doorways forced attackers to stoop, giving defenders easy headshots. Narrow corridors funneled people into single-file lines, great for ambushes. And uneven floors, not poor craftsmanship, just another way to trip someone wearing 60 pounds of armor. Even staircases were deliberately uneven. So if you were running up in a panic, you might misstep and tumble back down, giving defenders a nice little break to reload their crossbows. Castle design was full of these small acts of architectural spite. It's honestly impressive how much effort went into making life miserable for hypothetical intruders. The chapel, a calm corner in a violent world. Almost every major castle had a chapel. Because even in a fortress built for war, people still wanted a quiet place to negotiate with the divine, usually about not dying. The chapel was often the one truly beautiful room. Carved stone, small stained glass windows, flickering candles. It smelled like incense instead of people. And occasionally it doubled as an extra storeroom during sieges. Because when the food's running out, the sacred bread starts looking a little too practical. The kitchens, medieval chaos with knives. Castle kitchens were a world of their own. Hot, smoky, loud, and perpetually dangerous. Open fires roared under cauldrons big enough to swim in, while servants ran around trying not to spill boiling stew on themselves or anyone else. Meat hung from hooks, fish smoked over coals, and someone was always yelling about the bread. If you were a castle cook, you basically worked in the Middle Ages' most stressful restaurant, except your customers were armed nobles with questionable tempers. Still, the kitchen was vital during sieges. Salted meats, barrels of ale, and stores of grain were the difference between holding out for a month or resorting to something truly unpleasant. Bedrooms and hygiene. Lower your expectations. Okay, bedroom might be too strong a word. Most sleeping quarters were just small chambers, with wooden bedsteads stuffed with straw. If you were important, your straw might be clean. Blankets were furs. Pillows were luxury. And chamber pots. Let's just say the less we imagine, the better. Toilets or garderobes were little rooms built right into the outer wall, with a vertical shaft leading down to the moat or a cesspit. They were practical but not private. So yes, you might be sitting there, taking care of business, while a cold breeze whistled through the hole and a pigeon judged you from outside. It's humbling, really lighting and sound, the ambience of eternal dusk. Lighting a castle was a full-time job. Candles were expensive. Torches smoked up the walls and there weren't many windows, so most rooms were in perpetual twilight. Shadows in corners, echoes in corridors, the faint sound of dripping water somewhere you could never find. If you lived in one long enough, you probably started naming the echoes, but that same gloom helped during attacks. Dark hallways confused intruders. The acoustics made footsteps sound like they were coming from everywhere. In a way, castles used atmosphere as part of their defense, unsettling anyone foolish enough to step inside. The quiet power of fear. By now, you might notice something. Every design choice in a medieval castle was about psychological control. The thick walls didn't just keep people out, they reminded everyone inside who held power. The twisting corridors, the high towers, the cold halls, all of it said, "This is not your home unless you belong here." Even when peaceful, castles were intimidating. That was the point. They were statements carved in stone saying, "This is my world. Enter at your own risk," and for centuries that message worked. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially survived 2 parts of medieval architecture talk, which makes you tougher than most 12th century peasants. Now we're moving outside the walls. The air smells faintly of campfire smoke, unwashed soldiers, and very poor life choices. Because tonight we're exploring sieges, the slow, grinding chess match of medieval warfare, where patience killed faster than swords ever could. Forget the image of brave knights charging at gates in a heroic rush. That was for poems. Real sieges were long, miserable, and deeply boring. Most of the time nobody even fought. They just waited. For weeks, sometimes months. It was less Lord of the Rings and more waiting for Godot, but with plague. Setting the scene, the army arrives. Imagine you're the unlucky lord inside a castle. You wake up one morning, look out from your tower, and are wonderful. There's a small forest of enemy tents sprouting across the fields. You count them. Then you stop counting because there are too many. The banners flutter. There's a steady hammering as carpenters build wooden platforms and siege engines. And someone out there is playing a war drum like it's a motivational soundtrack. You sigh. You know what's coming. And the worst part? You can't do much about it. Once a siege began, there was no running to the neighbors for help. You were trapped. Your best hope was that reinforcements would arrive before you ran out of food, water, or morale. The first tactic, waiting you out. Here's the thing. Most sieges didn't involve constant fighting. They were games of attrition. The attackers surrounded the castle, cut off supplies and waited for hunger, thirst, and despair to do the heavy lifting. They'd block rivers, poison wells, burn nearby crops, anything to starve the defenders into surrender. And inside, it got grim fast. Remember all those barrels of salted meat and grain from the kitchens? They didn't last forever. People rationed bread down to tiny crusts. Water got murky. Rat suddenly seemed like a reasonable snack. Chroniclers have records of castles holding out for years, but most fell within a few months. Because sooner or later hunger wins. There's a saying, "Stone walls do not a fortress make." That's poetic, but also true, because the stomach doesn't care about masonry. Siege camps organized misery. On the outside, life wasn't much better. The besieging army had its own problems. Disease spread fast. Soldiers got bored, hungry, and occasionally mutinous. The camp itself was a mess, a maze of tents, fires, horses, and people complaining about the weather. Commanders tried to keep order, building small forts around the main castle to prevent surprise attacks. They called them siege castles, which is honestly a bit excessive, building a mini castle just to attack a bigger one. But that was medieval warfare for you. More stone, less sense, battering rams. Subtlety is overrated. When waiting didn't work, attackers brought out the toys. The battering ram was one of the oldest and simplest siege weapons. Picture a giant log, capped with iron, suspended by chains or ropes inside a wooden shed on wheels. Her team of soldiers would swing it rhythmically, slamming it into the castle gate until something gave, preferably not their shoulders. The wooden shed around it protected them from arrows and rocks. It was often covered with wet hides to prevent it from catching fire, because, yes, defenders loved tossing flaming things onto anything that moved. If the gate was strong, the ram might pound for days without success. It wasn't glamorous work, just repetitive, deafening, bone-rattling persistence. And if you're picturing brave knights doing this, don't. It was usually the lowest-ranked soldiers. Knights preferred to supervise from a safe distance while complaining about the lack of wine. Siege towers, rolling nightmares. Then there were siege towers. These were giant wheeled structures sometimes as tall as the castle walls themselves. Built from wood, covered in hides, filled with ladders and soldiers, the medieval version of an armored skyscraper on wheels. The idea was to roll it up to the wall, drop a drawbridge, and rush across onto the battlements. Simple, terrifying, and often a logistical disaster, because remember, moats, ditches, mud. Rolling a multi-ton wooden tower through that. Not easy. Sometimes attackers spent weeks building a road or filling in the moat just to move the thing into position. And all the while, defenders on the walls were politely dropping flaming barrels of pitch on their heads. Occasionally, the tower caught fire halfway there. At which point, everyone involved had a bad day mining's when you really hate digging. Another favorite technique was mining, also known as sapping. Attackers would tunnel under the castle walls, prop the tunnel up with wooden beams, then set those beams on fire. As the supports burned, the tunnel collapsed, taking part of the wall down with it. It was slow, filthy work. Miners dug through mud, rock, and sometimes sewage. Air was bad, lighting worse. You had to stay quiet too because defenders were listening. That's right, and countermining was a thing. The defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers' tunnels. Sometimes underground battles broke out, in total darkness with pickaxes and torches. It was less brave warfare and more nightmare coal mine from hell, and if the miners misjudged their direction or the soil, the tunnel could collapse early, killing everyone inside. Basically, it was high risk, low reward, but occasionally very effective. So let's talk about boiling oil. You've probably seen it in every medieval movie ever. Some terrified soldiers climb up a ladder and then, whoosh, someone above dumps a pot of scalding liquid onto their faces. It's cinematic. It's gruesome. It's also mostly exaggerated. You see, boiling oil was expensive. Oil wasn't cheap back then. It was basically liquid gold in the kitchen. So unless your castle was run by the medieval equivalent of Jeff Bezos, you weren't wasting olive oil on enemy soldiers. Instead, they used things like boiling water, sand, or even lime. Yes, sand. It heats up faster, sticks to your skin, and burns longer. The nightmare package. But it wasn't just about throwing hot stuff. The real genius was in where you threw it from. That's where the machicolations came in. Those lovely little stone overhangs you see on castle walls with gaps in the floor. You could stand safely above, dump whatever horrible thing you wanted, and no one could touch you. Now let's picture the scene. You're an invading knight, all proud in your shiny armor, thinking this'll be easy. You run up to the wall, set it, and suddenly it's raining boiling sand. Your helmet's cooking you alive. Your armor's hotter than a blacksmith's forge, and you start thinking maybe, just maybe, storming a castle wasn't such a great idea, but it gets better. Some defenders didn't stop at boiling sand. They got creative. They'd throw down rotting carcasses, beehives, or even chamber pots full of waste. Because if you can't stop the enemy with swords, You can always ruin their day with smell. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't heroic. But it was effective. Now, while all this chaos was happening on the walls, there was another line of defense, the moat. Ah yes, the moat, a wide trench, sometimes filled with water, sometimes just mud and spikes, romanticized in fairy tales, but in reality, it was mostly gross. Moats were full of sewage, garbage, and whatever the castle didn't want anymore. Falling into one wasn't just unpleasant. It was a one-way ticket to every medieval disease imaginable. But again, it worked. Horses couldn't cross. Siege towers got stuck. And soldiers? They had to wade through a toxic swamp before even reaching the walls. Not exactly morale boosting. Of course, not every moat had water. In colder climates, they were often dry, basically giant ditches. Still a pain to cross. Some were lined with sharp stakes. Others were just deep enough to trap anyone foolish enough to fall in. And if you somehow survived that, then you got to deal with the drawbridge, which, surprise, was usually raised by the time you got there. Let's float over to another clever bit of castle engineering. Murder holes. Despite the name, these weren't some medieval horror show. They were just holes in ceilings, typically above gateways or corridors, where defenders could drop rocks, hot water, or arrows on anyone passing below. It's the ultimate welcome mat. You'd think you're inside the gate, safe in, but no. You're in a stone tunnel, and people are dropping bad things on you from above. You can almost hear the medieval homeowner saying, "Thanks for visiting. Please enjoy our murder hole." Then there were portcullises, those heavy spiked gates made of iron or wood that could drop in an instant. They were perfect for trapping invaders inside a gatehouse, basically a medieval mousetrap. Once it came down, attackers were stuck between two portcullises with no cover, while arrows rained from slits above. If you've ever felt stuck in a bad situation, imagine being literally stuck in one while people pour sand on your head. And yet, even with all this, the moats, the walls, the boiling nonsense, people still tried. Siege warfare was like a stubborn chess game, where both sides refused to admit defeat. Because when castles got tougher, so did siege weapons. Let's glide over to that, the other half of this miserable equation. If castles were the iPhones of medieval defense, sleek, over-engineered and constantly upgraded, then siege weapons were the androids of destruction. Big, clunky, sometimes exploding, but incredibly powerful when they worked. The simplest method, the battering ram. Just a big log on ropes swung repeatedly at a gate. Very creative. It worked best when the defenders didn't have boiling sand handy. To protect the men swinging it, they'd build a little shed over the ram, sometimes covered in wet hides to stop it from catching fire. Because yes, setting rams on fire was a popular counterattack. Then there was the siege tower, basically a moving building on wheels. It was huge, creaky, and terrifying to push. The idea was to roll it right up to the wall, bridge the gap, and let soldiers storm across. Except you had to get close, which meant surviving arrows, fire, and probably some sarcastic yelling from above, and of course catapults and trebuchets. If the castle was too tall or too smug to approach, you just threw rocks at it until it wasn't. The trebuchet in particular was an engineering marvel, pure physics, no gunpowder. It could fling a 300-pound rock half a kilometer, or a dead cow. Because nothing says psychological warfare like a decomposing animal flying through the air. You might think that's over the top, but it wasn't just about smell. Disease was a real weapon. If an army outside had plague, they'd lob infected corpses over the walls. It was gross, horrifying, and effective. But castles evolved too. Thicker walls, angled bastions, rounded towers, all designed to deflect projectiles and make life miserable for trebuchet crews. And it worked. A good stone castle could take months, sometimes years, to crack. Now imagine that. You're sitting in a muddy camp outside the wall, eating cold gruel for the 200th day, while the people inside are eating roast meat and bread. And every time you build something, they set it on fire. At some point you start to wonder if the glory of medieval warfare was just a massive collective delusion. Yet, humans are persistent. They kept improving, inventing, and adapting. The age of the castle would eventually fall, not because of bad architecture, but because of gunpowder. But we're not there yet. Let's drift a little further, into the quieter side of castle defense. The human side. So far we've talked about walls, boiling sand, and rocks flying through the sky. But let's zoom in, past the battlements and into the castle itself. Because behind every sturdy wall and murder hole there were actual people. Real humans, doing their best to survive long, cold winters and the occasional siege that ruined everyone's week. Life inside a medieval castle wasn't glamorous. Not even close. Sure, the Lord might have a fancy hall and a big chair that technically made him important, but even he had to deal with drafts, smoke, and chamber pots that froze solid in winter. The movies forget to show that part. During a siege, everyone had a job. The knights defended, the soldiers patrolled, and the servants, well, they did everything else. The cooks had to stretch whatever food was left into something edible. The water carriers hauled buckets from wells, because no one wanted to drink moat water unless they were feeling particularly brave or already out of options. And the blacksmith? He never stopped working. Armor broke, weapons bent. Arrows needed heads. He was basically the medieval version of the IT guy, constantly fixing everything while everyone else complained. Of course, when the siege dragged on, and it always did, things got bleak. Food ran low. Morale ran lower. You started noticing how many rats there were, and then eventually you started noticing fewer rats, because people were eating them. And through it all, you still had to pretend everything was fine. Because if you were a noble, you couldn't let your soldiers see you panic. You had to walk around calmly, even when you knew the grain stores were nearly empty and the well tasted like despair. For ordinary folks, though, it was survival mode. Some castles had hidden gardens or little patches of farmland inside the outer walls. Not because anyone thought that was cute. It was so they wouldn't starve when things went bad. Others had pigeons or chickens, which were easy to keep and, frankly, a lot easier to eat than the warhorse tied up in the courtyard. Then there were the hygiene problems. Imagine hundreds of people crammed inside stone walls, sharing the same limited space for weeks or months. The toilets, or garderobes, emptied straight down the wall into the moat, which, if you recall, was already disgusting. So yes, it was a vicious circle of smell. The air would get thick with smoke, sweat, and the general scent of, "Please open the gates, we've had enough." And the only people who seemed happy about any of this were the rats. They always won sieges. Still, castle life had routines. At dawn, the guards switched shifts. Someone would light the fires in the great hall. The steward would check supplies and lie about how much food was left. And the priest, heartless because every castle had one, would hold prayers, mostly asking for the attackers to catch dysentery and go home. People adapted, as they always do. They patched walls, shared rations, told stories to pass the time, and tried to keep hope alive. Because as miserable as it could be inside those walls, it was still better than being outside, in the mud, under a trebuchet. And when the siege finally ended, and if it ended in survival, there was usually no great victory feast. Just relief. The fires were put out, the wounded were counted, and life awkwardly stumbled back toward normal. But let's not forget, castles weren't just military fortresses. They were homes. When the fighting stopped, these same walls echoed with laughter, music, and the clanking of dinner plates. Banquets were held in the same great halls where soldiers once slept on the floor. People got married here. Children were born here. The same walls that had seen war also saw daily life, messy, boring, and wonderfully human. Of course, all this would eventually change. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder started to make all those thick walls look less impressive. The trebuchet's elegant arc gave way to the blunt reality of cannons. And castles, these towering symbols of medieval pride, started to crumble not from neglect but from progress. So, let's drift slowly into the final stretch of our story, where the age of knights and moats gives way to a world of artillery, fortresses, and the slow death of the castle. The introduction of gunpowder to Europe was one of those quietly world-ending moments. Nobody knew it at the time, of course. They just saw a lot of smoke and noise and thought, well, that's fun. But once cannons entered the scene, castles didn't stand a chance. All that effort, the thick stone walls, the round towers, the angled battlements, it all became decoration. A well-placed cannonball could do more in an hour than a siege engine could in a week. Early cannons were clumsy, unreliable, and occasionally exploded, which made them both terrifying and hilarious. But they got better fast. By the 15th century, they could punch through castle walls like they were made of sand, and suddenly all that medieval engineering went out the window. Defenders tried to adapt. They made walls thicker, lower, and angled to deflect cannon fire. They dug deeper moats, added earthen banks, and built new star-shaped fortresses. But the days of the tall, romantic castle on a hill were numbered. Ironically, gunpowder made castles both obsolete and immortal. Obsolete because they no longer worked. Immortal because they became symbols. Relics of a time when defense was stone and siege was personal. And so the castle's story began to fade. Some were abandoned. Others were turned into noble homes, their murder holes sealed up, their drawbridges replaced with pleasant little stone arches. They became places for kings to host parties, not battles. But if you walk through one today, the cold corridors, the echoing great halls, you can still feel it. The layers of human history, the fear, the pride, the boredom. These were machines of survival, built by people who truly believed in walls, and maybe that's why we still love them. Because deep down, even in the age of skyscrapers, there's something comforting about a good, solid wall. Now, as the candles burn low and the siege drums fade into silence, let's end the night where we began, behind the walls. In the quiet heart of the medieval world, castles were not perfect. They leaked, they stank, and they fell down a lot. But they were also symbols of hope, humanity's stubborn, beautiful instinct to build something strong enough to outlast fear. And somehow, even after centuries of ruin, they still do. Inside the castle walls, daily life, food and the weird habits of the nobles all right. We've survived the sieges, the mud, the moats, and the smell of boiling sand. Now let's settle in, slow, calm, and sleepy, and take a long, comfortable wander through the inside of a medieval castle. Not during war this time, but on an ordinary day. Because for most of their existence, castles weren't constantly under attack. They were homes. Big, cold, echoing homes that somehow managed to be both grand and extremely inconvenient. And the people who lived in them, the nobles, servants, guards, cooks, and occasional visiting monk, had routines, meals, gossip, and all the awkward realities of everyday medieval life. So grab your imaginary torch. Let's stroll slowly through the corridors of the past. When you first step inside a castle, the first thing you notice is how dark it is. Movies always light castles like cozy mansions. But in reality, even at midday, the light struggled to squeeze through those tiny windows. Glass was expensive, so most castles didn't have much of it, just oiled parchment or wooden shutters. So the halls were dim, forever twilight, with torches sputtering along the walls, filling the air with smoke, and that lovely aroma of burning everything. The floors weren't smooth marble either. Most were rough stone or covered with straw rushes and the occasional chicken wandering by. The straw was changed maybe once a month if you were lucky, and in between it collected dust, bones and, let's just say, biological materials of mysterious origin. But let's not ruin the mood. Let's head into the Great Hall, the heart of castle life. This was the big room where everyone gathered, to eat, talk, or pretend to listen to whoever was in charge. It was smoky, noisy, and constantly busy. At one end was the Lord's table, raised slightly higher than everyone else's, because even dinner had to remind people of hierarchy. He'd sit there with his family, surrounded by the good silverware and maybe an extra candle or two. Real luxury. Everyone else sat lower down, with wooden bowls and whatever they could scrounge. Meals were a social event. There was no breakfast, lunch, and dinner like today. Just two main meals. One around late morning, another in the evening, depending on how much daylight was left. And if you were expecting individual plates, no. People shared trenchers, basically thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as plates. You'd pile food on top, eat what you could, and maybe nibble on the plate later. It was the original edible tableware. As for the food itself, let's be honest, it was a mixed bag. The wealthy loved showing off, so there were extravagant dishes, roasted swan, peacock with feathers reattached for presentation, or pies filled with live birds, because subtlety wasn't exactly their thing. But day to day, it was mostly bread, stew, and ale. Always ale. Everyone drank it, even kids. Water was risky business, so a light ale was considered the safe choice. Medieval hydration was basically permanent tipsiness. And salt, oh, salt was gold. It preserved meat, flavored everything, and was so valuable it literally defined class. Sitting above the salt at a feast meant you were important. Sitting below it meant you probably fetched the salt. Now, while nobles feasted, servants were everywhere, invisible but essential. Someone had to haul water, keep fires going, clean up, and handle the endless parade of chamber pots. There were cooks, bakers, butlers, grooms, pages, and guards, each with their own tiny slice of authority and an endless list of complaints. Castles ran like small cities, powered entirely by human effort. No plumbing, no heating, no peace. Let's drift upstairs, to the solar, the family's private room. Despite the romantic name, it wasn't particularly sunny. It was just less public. Here the lord and lady could retreat, read letters, do embroidery, or argue about taxes in private. And yes, they slept together in the same room, often with a few servants nearby. Privacy was a rare luxury. Curtains around the bed helped, but mostly just trapped the cold air in stylish new patterns. Speaking of beds, don't picture soft, fluffy mattresses. Think wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, and a lot of creaking. Blankets were wool or fur, heavy and scratchy. And if you woke up with a mouse running across your pillow, well, that was just castle life. Let's talk hygiene. Because if castles had a weak spot, it was definitely that. Bathing was complicated. The idea of cleanliness existed, but hot baths took effort. You needed water carried, heated, poured, and kept warm, and all of that took servants, time, and firewood. So most people bathed occasionally, maybe once a week if they were fancy, or on holidays if they weren't. Perfume, herbs, and clean linens helped mask the rest. The medieval approach to hygiene was basically out of sight, out of nose. Toilets or garderobes were narrow stone rooms with a hole in the bench, usually built into the outer wall, so gravity could take things where they needed to go. Sometimes they drained into the moat, sometimes they didn't. You can guess how pleasant that got in summer. The funny thing? The word garderobe literally means to guard clothes. People used to hang their garments in there, believing the smell would repel moths. Which it probably did. along with everything else. Now let's visit the quieter corners, the chapel, the kitchen, and maybe the towers. Every castle had a chapel. Religion wasn't optional. It was part of daily rhythm. Prayers in the morning, prayers before bed, prayers before doing anything remotely risky. The chapel was usually small but beautifully decorated, a rare splash of color and gold leaf in an otherwise grey world. Then came the kitchen, the castle's real furnace. Hot, smoky, and perpetually chaotic, roasting, boiling, baking, and yelling. The cooks were half artists, half survivors. They had to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds, with limited tools and unpredictable ingredients. Imagine trying to cook for an entire army using open fires, no ovens, and questionable meat. That was Tuesday. Kitchens were often separate from the main hall, because fire was the castle's worst enemy. And still they burned down often enough that some castles had backup kitchens. Always good to have a plan B when your soup takes the walls with it. Life in the towers was quieter. Cold but quiet. Guards on rotation would watch from the parapets, scanning for travelers, merchants, or anyone suspicious. At night it got lonely. Just the wind, the creak of wood, and the faint glow of torches below. They'd pass the time talking, or carving little symbols into the stone, tiny graffiti that, centuries later, archaeologists still find. Little hearts, crosses, names, even doodles of horses or birds, proof that even the grumpiest medieval guard still got bored sometimes. And then there were the noble hobbies, because what's the point of being rich and powerful if you can't fill the day with weird leisure activities? Hunting was the big one. It wasn't just sport, it was social theatre. Knights and nobles rode out in full armor to chase deer, boars, or the occasional unfortunate fox. Hunting taught bravery, horsemanship, and most importantly, gave everyone a reason to avoid castle chores. Falconry was another favorite. Training birds to hunt for you was the medieval version of having a really impressive gadget. And of course, music and storytelling filled the evenings. Minstrels, lutes, and long rambling tales about heroes, saints, and people who definitely never existed. But perhaps the most common pastime of all was gossip. Castles ran on gossip. Who visited whom? Who got new armor? Who looked miserable at dinner? It was the medieval version of social media, minus the Wi-Fi, plus a lot more embroidery. Yet beneath all the ritual, the rank, and the ridiculous hats, castle life was fragile. It was cold in winter, stuffy in summer, and entirely dependent on the land around it. A bad harvest, a flood, or a small rebellion could turn luxury into survival overnight. Still, the people living there adapted. They built, endured, and dreamed. They found joy in small things. A warm fire, a successful feast, a safe night without alarms. And that's the funny part about castles. For all their size and strength, they were really just big. Complicated shells trying to keep the world out. And the people inside warm, fed and hopeful. Even now, when we walk through their ruins, we feel something strangely human. They remind us of how far we've come, and how similar we still are. We still build walls, light fires, tell stories, and try to make it through the long nights. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the sound of footsteps echoing on cold stone floors. The flicker of torchlight, the distant murmur of people talking, cooking, laughing, and living, just as they did centuries ago. And outside, the wind brushing against the ancient walls, still standing, still keeping watch. The siege that never ends, and the quiet death of the castle. Age, so here we are, the late medieval period, the point in history where castles start realizing they're kind of obsolete. Like an aging celebrity who suddenly discovers that the world has moved on to new things. Gunpowder was the paparazzi of doom for castle life. Once cannons entered the chat, those tall romantic walls we love to imagine, the towers, The battlements, the grand gates, well, they turned into very expensive targets. Let's set the mood. It's the late 1400s. A knight in shining armor rides up to his lord's castle. He expects to see a glorious fortress of stone. Instead, he finds workers digging trenches, piling earth, and building weird, low-sloped walls. It doesn't look majestic. It looks like a dirt pancake. But that's the point. A cannonball could easily shatter tall stone, but earth and angled masonry? That stuff just absorbs the impact like a medieval crash pad. We're entering what you might call the awkward teenage years of fortress design, where castles were half old-school romantic tower, half practical gun platform. Italy led the way with star forts, those spiky, angular structures that look beautiful from above, but were basically nightmares for any attacking army. But before we say goodbye to our classic castle friends, let's take a slow walk through what a siege looked like. Because that's really where you see how castles defended themselves when things got ugly. Picture it. A foggy morning. The castle sits on a hill, maybe overlooking a small river. Down below, an army begins to gather. The air smells like smoke and damp wool. The defenders wake up, stretch, yawn, and start doing the same thing they always do during sieges, checking the walls, fetching more stones for throwing, making sure the water supply isn't poisoned, and praying. Always praying. Because, let's be honest, sieges were awful. Not the exciting, action-packed things you see in movies. No, real sieges were slow, muddy, and deeply boring. Until they weren't. Imagine weeks of waiting, eating stale bread, smelling everyone's unwashed armor, and wondering whether that trebuchet sound in the distance means your wall is about to collapse. Now let's talk tactics, calmly, like a bedtime story about logistical misery. If you were an attacker, you had a few choices. You could starve them out, set up camp, cut off supplies, and wait until everyone inside gets tired, hungry, and cranky enough to surrender. Batter the walls. Bring in siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, or later cannons, and spend your days throwing rocks and iron until something gives way. Go underground, literally. You could tunnel beneath the walls and try to collapse them. This was called sapping, and yes, it was just as miserable and dangerous as it sounds. Go over the top. Bring ladders, siege towers, and a lot of bravery. Or stupidity, depending on how you look at it. Meanwhile, the defenders were doing the opposite of all that. They'd drop rocks, pour boiling water or oil, shoot arrows, or use crossbows from those cozy arrow slits. Some castles even had murder holes, openings above gateways where you could drop things on invaders. And by things, I mean stones, hot sand, and occasionally very unpleasant liquids that didn't come from a kitchen. Every castle had its personality when it came to defense. Some were clever. For example, Conwy Castle in Wales had concentric walls, one set inside another, so even if the enemy broke through, they just find another ring waiting for them. It's like a stone onion of disappointment. Then there were castles with hidden posterns, small secret doors that defenders could use for surprise raids or, when things went really south, for sneaking out under the cover of darkness. Because even the bravest knight sometimes realized, yeah, maybe not dying in this mud pit is the better choice. But here's the funny thing. Most sieges didn't end with massive battles or glorious last stands. They ended quietly. The food ran out. Disease spread. Morale broke. And one morning, a small group of exhausted people would walk out with a white flag, while the other side just sighed in relief that it was finally over. And yet, despite how brutal it all sounds, there's something strangely peaceful about this era. The castle, with its high walls and small windows, became a symbol of both safety and isolation. Inside, life went on. Prayers, meals, stories told by the hearth. Outside, the world shifted. Gunpowder grew louder. Kingdoms merged and modernized. Castles started looking less like fortresses and more like mansions pretending to be fortresses. Think of Windsor Castle or Neuschwanstein in Bavaria. They weren't really built to repel armies anymore. They were built to impress, to host banquets, to show off wealth and nostalgia. It's like the medieval world collectively decided to cosplay its own past. By the time the Renaissance rolled in, the age of the true castle was quietly fading away. Fortresses turned into palaces. Moats became gardens, knights became courtiers, and those proud walls that once bristled with arrows now held tapestries and chandeliers. Let's pause for a moment on that image. A castle that once withstood years of siege, now echoing with music, laughter, and maybe the occasional snarky gossip about someone's bad doublet. The stone remains, but the purpose changes. It's kind of poetic, isn't it? The same towers that once watched for enemy banners now watch the sunset. The same gates that opened for soldiers now open for guests in carriages. The same walls that echoed with cries of battle now just hum with wind and silence, and yet, when you stand near one today, maybe on a misty morning in Scotland, or under the pale sky of France, you can still feel it. The weight of centuries, the quiet memory of defense, the hum of 1,000 lives that came and went behind those cold stones. Castles didn't die, they just retired. So the next time you see one, whether it's a ruin on a cliff or a fairy tale palace reflected in a lake, remember that it once stood against everything the world could throw at it. Arrows, fire, time, and finally irrelevance. And somehow it's still there, still standing, still waiting, still whispering stories about the people who once called it home. Now, let's slowly drift from those lonely ramparts to the soft afterglow of what came next, the dawn of modern fortifications, and how humans never really stopped building walls. We just changed what we were defending. The rise of gunpowder forts and the last stand of stone castles are, let's drift gently now, out of the Middle Ages. The wind is quieter. The torches are out. The banners have faded. And down the road we can just barely hear a new sound, the low, steady thump of cannon fire. That's the noise that ended the Castle Age. Not a dramatic explosion or fiery siege, just methodical, patient destruction. By the 15th and 16th centuries, gunpowder had become the new favorite toy of kings, generals, and ambitious engineers. And like most new technology, everyone was both fascinated and mildly terrified by it. The first cannons were absurd, huge, unreliable, and more likely to blow up in your face than hit anything important. But as the decades rolled on, they got better, stronger, more accurate, and very, very good at tearing down centuries-old architecture. Stone walls that had once stood proud against catapults and battering rams started crumbling in hours. Some castles were abandoned entirely after just one demonstration. Imagine the shock. You've spent generations building the perfect fortress, and now some guy rolls up with a metal tube full of noisy magic powder. And poof, half your wall is gone before lunch, and so began the quiet panic of European nobility. How do you defend your shiny, inherited seat of power when suddenly height and grandeur make you easier to hit? The answer, as usual in history, was to throw money and geometry at the problem. Enter the age of bastions, ravelins and star forts. Now, if you've ever looked at one of these from above, you'll notice they look like snowflakes designed by a mathematician with anxiety. Sharp angles, layers, trenches, ditches, every wall facing another so that defenders could shoot down the attackers who dared approach. It was beautiful, in a weird way. This new science of defense. Gone were the romantic towers and soaring battlements. In came low, squat, earth-packed walls covered with grass, hiding gun positions that could blast anything that moved. The castle, once proud and vertical, had gone horizontal. One of the earliest and most famous of these was the Italian star fort design, perfected in places like Verona and Florence. The concept spread like wildfire across Europe. France, Spain, the Low Countries, everyone wanted one. Not because they were cozy, they weren't, but because they worked. And let's be honest, people still liked the idea of looking intimidating from above, even if it was now in a more pragmatic, polygonal way. But something funny happened while everyone was busy redrawing blueprints. Castles didn't just vanish. Some stubbornly tried to evolve. Take Warwick Castle in England. It started as a wooden fort back in 1068, all moats and murder holes, and by the 16th century, it had politely decided it was done being useful. It turned itself into a stately home. A castle in name, but really a fancy backdrop for noble dinners and peacocks. Then there was Château de Chambord in France, which looks like it can't decide whether it's a fortress, a palace, or a fever dream designed by someone who's had too much Renaissance wine. It has towers but no real defenses, walls but purely decorative. It's all show, no shield. And that's exactly what the age demanded, because by now defense wasn't just about stone. It was about style. You could hire an architect who understood how to make you look safe, even if no one was actually attacking. A little moat here, a symbolic tower there, just enough medieval flair to say, yes, I'm noble, and also I can afford this nonsense. Meanwhile, the professionals and the real soldiers had moved on to proper fortifications. Take Palmanova in Italy, built by the Venetians around 1593. It's the ultimate geometric dream fortress, a perfect nine-pointed star city designed so every bastion covers the next. If you attacked one wall, 3 others could shoot at you from the side. It was efficient, mathematical, and what, because this is Italy, also incredibly aesthetic. These new forts were designed with a calm, deadly logic. There was no romance in them. No fairy tale turrets, just angles, precision, and gunpowder. They were, in a sense, the anti-castles. Everything that made medieval fortresses charming, the uneven towers, the tall keeps, the winding staircases, was now considered a structural weakness. And yet, people still built castles. They just pretended not to. Because deep down, humanity has always been weirdly sentimental about stone walls. We love the idea of safety, even when it's an illusion. And for nobles, that illusion became part of their identity. By the 1600s and 1700s, you could walk through Europe and find entire landscapes dotted with mock castles. They had battlements that never saw battle, drawbridges that didn't move, arrow slits that led nowhere. These were the architectural equivalent of someone buying medieval armor to wear to a dinner party. And honestly, it's kind of adorable. Castles had gone from being the backbone of feudal survival to a nostalgic hobby for rich people. They became symbols of heritage, of continuity, of don't forget that my great-great-grandfather once owned half of Wales. But outside those cozy, echoing halls, the real world kept modernizing. Cannons grew into artillery. Muskets turned into rifles. And by the time of Napoleon, even the most advanced star fort couldn't stop the sheer scale of modern warfare. The walls got lower. The moats got filled. The armies got bigger. And somewhere in the quiet countryside, a lone medieval keep stood in the mist, crumbling gently, still clinging to the past, like an old knight polishing his sword while everyone else carries pistols. It's strangely comforting to think about. Even as humanity reinvented everything, the way we fight, build, and live, some of those old stones just refused to fall. They became ruins, yes, but beautiful ones. And ruins, as we know, have their own kind of peace. So when you visit one today, maybe a mossy tower on a hill in Ireland, or a half-fallen gate in Normandy, you're not really looking at a failure of design. You're looking at the fossil of an idea, that humans once believed they could wall themselves off from danger forever. They couldn't, of course, but they tried. And they built some of the most hauntingly beautiful monuments to that dream. Let's end this section by standing quietly, in imagination, before one of those fading castles. The stones are cold. The air smells like rain. There's no sound, just the soft rustle of ivy climbing where archers once stood. And maybe if you listen long enough, you'll almost hear it. The echo of a horn, the creak of a gate, the faint murmur of people who once believed this wall was the edge of their world. Because in a way, it still is. The castle's afterlife, ruins, romantics, and ghosts of stone. So the cannons have gone quiet. The banners are packed away. The knights are long gone, and the world has moved on to powdered wigs and tea sets. But out there, bescattered across the misty hills of Europe, the old castles are still standing. Barely. Cracked. Leaning, covered in ivy, but somehow still there. This is the era where castles stop being fortresses and start being memories, and humans, being the sentimental creatures we are, immediately started falling in love with the ruins. Because of course we did. We can't resist a good ruin. The broken tower, the crumbling wall, the empty great hall. They all whisper just loud enough for the imagination to fill in the rest. It began in the 1700s. Enlightenment thinkers were obsessed with reason, progress, and symmetry. And yet, paradoxically, they were also obsessed with old stone ruins. Poets like to say they represented the fleeting nature of human achievement, which sounds deep, until you realize it mostly meant rich people taking picnics in the shadow of collapsed battlements, while feeling vaguely sad about mortality. Then came the Romantic era. And oh boy, castles suddenly became cool again. Not practical, not useful, but deeply aesthetically moody. Artists painted them. Poets wrote about them. Composers wrote music that sounded like thunder echoing off their walls. It was the 18th and 19th centuries version of Gothic nostalgia, all about lost grandeur, tragic beauty, and just the right amount of fog. And if there's one thing the Romantics loved more than ruins, it was rebuilding them. Badly. We start seeing what I like to call Disney castles before Disney. Take Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, built in the late 1800s by King Ludwig II, who basically said, "I want a medieval fortress, but make it fabulous. It has towers that point nowhere, balconies for no reason, and interiors that look like someone told an artist, imagine medieval, but with unlimited glitter." Ludwig didn't build it for war. He built it for fantasy. It was a love letter to the idea of castles, a dream of knights, dragons, and eternal grandeur, all safely tucked away from the very modern world of politics and railroads, and he wasn't alone. Across Europe, aristocrats started restoring ruins in ways that were creative. They'd rebuild towers that had never existed, add moats to castles that never had them, paint fake cracks onto new walls so they looked properly ancient. It was the architectural equivalent of vintage Instagram filters. In England, Horace Walpole did something similar with his home, Strawberry Hill. He turned a simple villa into a Gothic wonderland of pointed arches, turrets, and stained glass, and kick-started a whole trend of Gothic revival architecture. By the 1800s, the medieval aesthetic was back in full swing. You could find castle motifs in furniture, fashion, even wallpaper. The same societies that once used gunpowder to destroy fortresses were now putting miniature battlements on their houses for decoration. Because irony never goes out of style. But beyond the fashion and fantasy, there was something deeper going on. For centuries, castles had represented power, the hard, defensive kind. Now they started to represent something else entirely: memory, permanence, the comforting illusion that some things could still last forever, even in a world changing too fast for comfort. And if we're being honest, castles became perfect backdrops for a little bit of supernatural drama. Ghost stories started clinging to them like ivy. Headless knights, weeping queens, phantom footsteps in empty corridors. Every ruin seemed to come with its own haunting. And why not? Old walls and tragedy go hand in hand. A few centuries of murder, betrayal, and candlelight dinners will do that to a place. Sometimes the ghosts were metaphorical, symbols of history that refused to fade. Other times people swore they were real. At Chillingham Castle in Northumberland, for example, people still talk about the Blue Boy, a child whose cries were said to echo through the walls at midnight. At Edinburgh Castle, guards have reported hearing bagpipes in the dungeons, from a player who went missing centuries ago in the tunnels below. Are the stories true? Probably not, but they're wonderful to tell in the dark. And they keep the castles alive in a way that history books can't, because a ruin without a story is just rock. But a ruin with a ghost, that's poetry. Even now in our world of skyscrapers and digital walls, castles still hold this strange gravity. They don't scare us anymore, but they pull us in. Every tourist who walks through a mossy gate or runs a hand along cold stone is doing the same thing, trying to touch time. And in a sense, that's what the afterlife of castles is all about. Not defense, not war, not even architecture, just the quiet endurance of memory. A castle is, fundamentally, a human dream made solid, and like all dreams, it fades. Slowly. Beautifully. Think of a ruined tower at sunset. The grass has grown up through the cracks. A bird nests where once there were guards. The air hums with stillness. You can almost imagine the past as a shadow, faint but present. And if you close your eyes, you can hear it. Not loud, just softly. The distant murmur of a world that used to be made of stone, iron, and faith. The age of castles ended long ago. But their ghosts, the ideas they stood for, they still wander. We still build walls. We still crave safety. We still fall in love with the illusion of permanence. Maybe that's why we never really let castles die. They were built to defend against the world outside. And somehow they ended up defending us against forgetting. So next time you pass a ruined keep, or see one glowing under the moonlight in some far-off valley, don't think of war or kings or battles. Think of time itself wearing a crown of ivy. Quiet, stubborn, beautiful. Still standing, still dreaming. The castle's afterlife. Ruins, romantics, and ghosts of stone so. The cannons have gone quiet. The banners are packed away. The knights are long gone, and the world has moved on to powdered wigs and tea sets. But out there and scattered across the misty hills of Europe, the old castles are still standing. Barely. Cracked. Leaning, covered in ivy, but somehow still there. This is the era where castles stop being fortresses and start being memories, and humans, being the sentimental creatures we are, immediately started falling in love with the ruins, because of course we did. We can't resist a good ruin. The broken tower, the crumbling wall, the empty great hall. They all whisper just loud enough for the imagination to fill in the rest. It began in the 1700s. Enlightenment thinkers were obsessed with reason, progress, and symmetry. And yet, paradoxically, they were also obsessed with old stone ruins. Poets like to say they represented the fleeting nature of human achievement, which sounds deep, until you realize it mostly meant rich people taking picnics in the shadow of collapsed battlements while feeling vaguely sad about mortality. Then came the Romantic era, and oh boy, castles suddenly became cool again. Not practical, not useful, but deeply aesthetically moody. Artists painted them. Poets wrote about them. Composers wrote music that sounded like thunder echoing off their walls. It was the 18th and 19th centuries version of Gothic nostalgia, all about lost grandeur. Tragic beauty, and just the right amount of fog. And if there's one thing the Romantics loved more than ruins, it was rebuilding them. Badly. We start seeing what I like to call Disney castles before Disney. Take Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, built in the late 1800s by King Ludwig II, who basically said, "I want a medieval fortress. But make it fabulous. It has towers that point nowhere, balconies for no reason, and interiors that look like someone told an artist, imagine medieval, but with unlimited glitter." Ludwig didn't build it for war. He built it for fantasy. It was a love letter to the idea of castles, a dream of knights, dragons, and eternal grandeur, all safely tucked away from the very modern world of politics and railroads. And he wasn't alone. Across Europe, aristocrats started restoring ruins in ways that were creative. They'd rebuild towers that had never existed, add moats to castles that never had them, paint fake cracks onto new walls so they looked properly ancient. It was the architectural equivalent of vintage Instagram filters. In England, Horace Walpole did something similar with his home, Strawberry Hill. He turned a simple villa into a Gothic wonderland of pointed arches, turrets, and stained glass, and kick-started a whole trend of Gothic revival architecture. By the 1800s, the medieval aesthetic was back in full swing. You could find castle motifs in furniture, fashion, even wallpaper. The same societies that once used gunpowder to destroy fortresses were now putting miniature battlements on their houses for decoration. Because irony never goes out of style, but beyond the fashion and fantasy, there was something deeper going on. For centuries, castles had represented power, the hard, defensive kind. Now they started to represent something else entirely. Memory, permanence, the comforting illusion that some things could still last forever, even in a world changing too fast for comfort. And if we're being honest, castles became perfect backdrops for a little bit of supernatural drama. Ghost stories started clinging to them like ivy. Headless Knee, the modern castle. From fortresses to fantasy homes, sir. We've made it all the way from flaming arrows and boiling oil to marble staircases and gift shops. Quite the journey. The medieval castle, that old symbol of power and paranoia, has now found a new job as being charming, which, to be fair, is a lot less stressful. Let's drift into the modern era, where the castle is no longer a fortress but a mood. By the 19th and 20th centuries, real castles were mostly ruins, museums or overly dramatic vacation homes for aristocrats who couldn't quite let go of their titles. The nobility, bless them, were still clinging to stone walls, while the rest of society was busy inventing trains, electricity, and indoor plumbing. It's a funny contrast. Peasants once died trying to take these fortresses, and now tourists buy postcards of them. There's something poetic about that, in a mildly sarcastic way. Take Windsor Castle, for example, still technically a functioning royal residence. The British monarchy loves that place. It's ancient, cold, drafty, and probably smells faintly of history and floor polish. Yet it's still a symbol. Not of defense anymore, but of endurance. It tells the world, yes, we've been here forever. Please ignore the Wi-Fi routers tucked behind the portraits. And then there's Edinburgh Castle, perched dramatically on its volcanic rock. It hasn't seen a real battle in centuries, but every August it's filled with fireworks, bagpipes, and tourists eating overpriced sandwiches. Once a fortress of war, now a fortress of photo ops. In France, many of the Grand Chateaux, like Chambord or Chenonceau, became the crown jewels of heritage tourism. They host galas, wine tastings, and occasionally the kind of weddings that make you question your entire financial plan, because that's what castles are now, aspirational nostalgia. They're places where people go to pretend for just a few hours that the world is still made of stone and ceremony, instead of glass and Wi-Fi. And that longing for castle life didn't stop at tourism. Oh no, it evolved into something wonderfully strange. Welcome to the age of modern castles. If you go looking, you'll find them everywhere. Canada, America, Australia, even the deserts of the Middle East. Some are inspired by real medieval fortresses. Others look like the love child of a Gothic cathedral and a billionaire's Pinterest board. For example, there's Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. Built in the 1890s by George Washington Vanderbilt, because apparently one Washington wasn't enough. It's a castle in everything but name. Towers, grand halls, hidden servant corridors, and enough rooms to lose your sense of direction permanently. It's the largest privately owned home in the United States, and honestly, it looks like it's waiting for a visiting duke at any moment. Then there's Bolt Castle in New York's Thousand Islands, a love story carved in stone. Built by a hotel magnate for his wife, it was left unfinished when she died suddenly. The workers just stopped. Tools down, scaffolding up, and silence. It sat abandoned for 70 years before being restored, slowly, as if the castle itself was grieving. Romantic, melancholy, a perfect ghost of modern chivalry. And of course, there's Hearst Castle in California, built by newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. If medieval lords flaunted power with moats and battlements, Hearst did it with swimming pools and movie stars. It's part castle, part art museum, part fever dream, the kind of place where you can imagine knights replaced by Hollywood actors arguing about lighting, but the real cultural resurrection of the castle, the one that cemented it forever in our collective imagination, came from somewhere entirely different. Movies. When Walt Disney saw Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, he decided, yep, that's it. That's the dream. He turned it into the template for every fairy tale castle ever drawn. Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White. They all trace their roots back to that 19th century fantasy fortress built by a lonely Bavarian king. And thus, the castle was reborn, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of wonder, a safe, glowing silhouette of happily ever after. It's kind of ironic, really. The medieval castle existed to keep the world out. The Disney castle exists to invite everyone in, and yet in both cases the message is the same. Here is safety. Here is magic. Here is something solid in a world that keeps changing. In the modern world, that illusion still works. There are people today, quite a few actually, who build their own castles. You'll find YouTube channels dedicated to it. Couples who spend years crafting miniature fortresses in rural fields, complete with towers, gates, and solar panels. The perfect blend of medieval and modern anxiety. We still crave the same thing the lords and ladies once did. Control, comfort, permanence. We just build it with better plumbing. Some castles today are luxury hotels, some are private homes, some are even tech billionaire bunkers disguised as historic estates. It's funny how the idea loops back on itself. 1,000 years later, we're still building walls. Still trying to make the chaos of the world stay politely outside. But there's one big difference now. We know it's a fantasy. When a medieval baron looked out from his battlements, he really believed the walls would keep him safe. We don't. We know time, weather, politics, they get in anyway. So when we walk through a castle now, we're not admiring its defenses. We're admiring its endurance. 1,000 years of reign. Earthquakes, wars, tourists, and somehow it's still there. Still whispering the same quiet story. Humans build walls because we're afraid of the dark, and then we fill those walls with light. That's the story of every castle, from the smoky halls of early feudal lords to the glowing spires of Disneyland. We built them because we wanted to feel safe. We rebuilt them because we wanted to remember. And we keep dreaming of them because deep down, we still want to believe there's a gate that can close the world out. Why castles still matter, the walls we keep building, and now we come to the quiet part of the story. The fires are out, the stones are cool again. The echoes of armor and footsteps have long faded into the air. We've watched castles rise, fall, and return, in memory, in tourism, in fantasy. But now we ask the gentlest question of all. Why do they still matter to us? Because they do. Even now you can feel it, can't you? That little twinge when you see a photo of a misty ruin perched on a cliff, or a perfect round tower half covered in ivy. It's not just admiration, it's recognition. Something deep and wordless that hums inside you. Castles are not just buildings. They're symbols of what we've always longed for: safety, belonging, and permanence. The world today moves too fast, changes too easily. We live in glass towers, not stone ones, and yet we still crave that same sense of being protected, of having somewhere solid when everything else feels temporary. The medieval lord built a wall because he feared the next invasion. We build ours out of routines, screens, passwords, and social masks, different materials, same purpose. We still make castles. They just look different now. Every time you lock your front door, every time you curl under a blanket, every time you retreat into silence after a long day, that's your little castle. Your moat might be a boundary. Your drawbridge might be a do not disturb sign, and that's okay. It's what humans do. We build safety around ourselves, then we slowly decorate it with meaning. That's why the sight of a ruined keep or a crumbling tower still moves us, because we see ourselves in it. Once that fortress was new, proud, defiant. Now it's soft around the edges, moss creeping over stone, its battles long over. And in that stillness, there's beauty, the beauty of survival. When we stand in the ruins of a castle, we aren't looking at failure. We're looking at endurance. 1,000 storms later, and the walls still stand. 1,000 human lives pass through them. Soldiers, servants, kings, cooks, lovers, children, and something of all of them lingers in the stone. It's humbling. It's peaceful. And it's strangely comforting, because deep down we know we won't last forever either. But maybe, and just maybe, in something we built will a story, a kindness, a song, a memory. That's our version of stonework, our way of leaving behind a little fortress against time. The people of the Middle Ages never imagined tourists wandering through their castles with cameras and ice cream cones. They built for war, not wonder. Yet somehow, through all the centuries, their walls became something far softer. They became a mirror of who we were and who we still are. Fragile creatures trying to make a safe place in an unpredictable world. So when you next see a castle, on a hill, in a book, or glowing on a movie screen, remember what it really is. It's not just history. It's a heartbeat, carried across 1,000 years, a reminder that even the strongest walls fall, and that sometimes that's okay, because when the walls crumble, the view opens, and in that open air you can see the world again, wide, wild, and beautiful. Maybe that's the real ending to the story of castles. Not conquest, not collapse, but quiet understanding that every stone we set, every barrier we raise, and every dream we build comes in the end from the same simple hope that there will always be a place, somewhere where we can feel safe enough to rest. And maybe, if we listen closely, the ruins whisper it still. So here we are. The fire's gone low. The torches have burned down to little orange size. The last echo of our story fades somewhere between the ramparts and the stars. You can almost hear it, the hum of silence that only ancient places know. A castle at rest, the earth holding its breath around old memories. It's strange, isn't it, how places can feel alive long after their people are gone. Stone has no heartbeat, no breath, no thought, and yet it remembers. You can feel it when you walk through those cold halls. the weight of footsteps that used to mean something, the quiet pride of walls that once kept the world at bay. They say history is written by the victors, but I think the ruins write something different, slower, truer. They don't boast, they don't argue, they just exist. Every fallen castle is a monument to impermanence, and yet it's also proof that even impermanence can endure for centuries. That's the strange comfort of history. It reminds us that everything changes, but nothing truly disappears. Not completely. Not if someone remembers. And you've remembered tonight. You've listened to the lives of stones and soldiers, of kings and cooks, of ordinary people who once thought their world would last forever. And maybe in their stories, you've found a little of your own reflection. Because really, the human heart hasn't changed much since the age of castles. We still build, love, defend, fall, and rebuild again. The walls just look different now. Glass instead of granite, pixels instead of parapets. But the feeling? The longing for safety, meaning, and belonging? That's eternal. So if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Let the story drift into dreams, the way fog gathers on a quiet medieval morning. Picture a castle one last time. Maybe it's one you've seen before, or one your imagination built from all these whispered details. It stands on a hill. The wind is gentle. The banners are faded but still there. Inside there's no battle, no noise, only calm. You walk through the gate. Your footsteps echo softly in the courtyard. The air smells faintly of old rain and stone dust, and somewhere deep within the keep a small light flickers, a hearth that's been burning quietly for 1,000 years, waiting for someone to notice. Maybe that someone is you, so stay a moment. Let your mind settle like dust on a stone floor. There's nothing to defend tonight, no moat to cross, no alarm bell to ring, just quiet. And warmth, and the soft hum of a world that has finally mercifully gone still. Good night, traveler of old walls. Sleep well in the shadow of history. And may the stones keep their stories until morning. And that is where we'll close the gates for tonight. The fire in the great hall burns low, the banners hang still, and somewhere in the courtyard an old suit of armor finally exhales. If you're still awake, first of all, impressive. You've just outlasted 1,000 years of medieval engineering and an hour and a half of gentle mumbling about moats. That's not nothing. But if your eyes are heavy now, if your thoughts are wandering down those quiet stone corridors, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. That's how history should feel at midnight. Slow, soft, familiar. We've built walls, climbed towers, poured boiling oil, and watched kingdoms fade into dust. And somehow we ended up here, just two people sharing an echo across time. You resting in your own quiet keep, and me still talking about castles long after everyone else has gone to bed. If you enjoyed drifting through history, tonight, if you like your medieval warfare served with a side of sleepy sarcasm, you can always stay a while longer. There's plenty more where this came from. We've got doomed dynasties, cursed crowns, and entire families who really should have stopped marrying their cousins, but, you know, commitment to the bit. So if you want to keep exploring, you can subscribe, leave a little sleepy comment, or just let the algorithm tuck you in with the next story. No pressure. This channel isn't going anywhere. Maybe next time we'll visit the palaces that fell apart from the inside, or the kings who ruled everything except themselves. Or maybe we'll just wander through another half-forgotten ruin, listening to the wind tell secrets it barely remembers. For now, though, just breathe. Let the echoes fade. Let the world outside your walls grow quiet. History will wait. It always does, so wherever you are, beneath your blankets, your ceiling fan, your own little modern castle, I hope you sleep deeply tonight. I hope the past feels a little less heavy, and the present a little more peaceful. Good night, traveler of time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying, and thank you for caring about the strange, soft corners of history. Until next time, rest well, dream of old stone walls, and remember, even after all these centuries, the stories still stand.